I'm Nick Newton, joined by Will Miles. Welcome to Stand Up in the Holler. On tonight's episode, we'll break down a massive week on the recruiting trail featuring a few of the Gators' biggest wins yet. We'll start with two bits, analyzing the commitments of Kelby Collins, Will Norman, and Cameron James along the defensive front. For four bits, Jaden Robinson flips and Miles Graham gets the 2024 class off to a great start. We'll also talk a little bit about the decommitment of Keon Keeley from Tampa there, Berkeley Prep. Six bits, we'll get into some news and notes from camp. And for $1, we'll wrap up talking about the Big Ten's big new deal, big television contract there in Big Ten country and what that could potentially mean for the SEC down the road. Will, how's it going, man? Before we dive into everything, 1 week closer to football season. Literally, this is the last week without college football on the weekend schedule. We got college football coming back next week, Will.
Yeah, it's funny. As we're recording, the Chicago Bears are playing, which means we're almost watching like lower level football anyway. So, it's August is when all that stuff starts, right? You get the preseason games where you watch the first two series and then go off and do something else. And then college football hits. And the minute it hits, it's just 3-4 straight months of every weekend. You got that rhythm. And, that's cool. It's a comforting thing to have that coming into our lives because, it's been away for a while. And, to be honest, I think I appreciate it now more after 2020, where the Big Ten almost finked out and almost canceled the season on everybody. And then the SEC had to goad them into playing like a five game season. So, it's interesting times and certainly with Napier coming in, there's a lot of excitement around Gainesville. So it's fun to get ready.
What's the over under on how far you make it into the 10:30 kickoff of Vanderbilt in Hawaii next weekend?
Oh, I'm watching that whole game, buddy. I'm excited for Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's like an analytics wet dream, man. You just sit there and go, all right, like let's see what Barton Simmons. Let's see what he's got. Let's see what he's got cooking with Clark Lee and look, somebody's got to start. Somebody has to put Kentucky and South Carolina in their place, and it's going to be Vanderbilt. So let's see that happen.
Look, I understand 10:30 p.m. Eastern kickoff is on the early side for Hawaii. They go at midnight sometimes, but I could have done an 8 p.m. kickoff for that game. That would have been a little nicer, but we'll see. It'll be the first weekend back. We'll have enough adrenaline to make it through. Will let's go to two bits here. Kelby Collins, defensive lineman from Gardendale, Alabama, 6'4", 265 pounds. According to 24/7 Sports, Collins is a top 100 player nationally, top 8 defensive linemen in this class, and he is the 8th ranked player from Alabama. He gives Napier and company a head-to-head win on the recruiting trail against both Alabama, which in state, as well as Georgia. So not only does Collins stand at 6'5", Will, but he weighs close to 280 pounds heading into his senior year of high school. He said of his commitment, this is from On3, by the way, this quote: "I want to be different. Alabama is a great school. I have been there a lot, and I like what Alabama is about, but Florida just feels right. Going to Florida allows me to get out of Alabama, see new things, explore new things, and it is something I've been thinking about for a long time." In terms of the tape, Will, he is huge. He uses his body well. He's almost a roadblock whenever he wants to sit down and just tell the offensive lineman we're not going anywhere, and he just wants to the clog up, congest the middle there on the outside there. He has no problem stopping the run, but he also is in the backfield a whole lot. He's really the total package. He's the type of guy that you can really play at any spot across the defensive line. And again, going head to head with Alabama and Georgia, and Florida coming out on top with this recruitment, Will, with the kid from Alabama. I think this is a massive statement from Napier and company and the top ranked player on the board at this point, Will.
Yeah, I mean, we've been saying this now for like 4 straight weeks. Is that anytime Napier adds somebody who's the highest player on his board, it's been a good week, and he's done it now for like 4 straight weeks. Where originally it was T.J. Searcy, then it was Eugene Wilson, then it was Aiden Mizell, and now Kelby Collins. So kudos to Napier for bringing in these guys. Kudos for the guys, Coach Spencer obviously on the defensive line bringing these guys in. Look, defensive line's been a major area of weakness for Florida, and so you bring in a guy like Desmond Watson, who's incredibly talented, but also, has a flaw, right? We can see the flaw, and it's in his listing in terms of weight, and that's something he's got to get under control. And I'm sure he will, and I'm sure he's going to do a great job. But the same thing. You can't say the same thing about Kelby Collins, right? 6'5", 280. He's coming in essentially as a fully formed defensive lineman who's going to be able to come in and contribute right away. Maybe he's not a starter right away, but he's going to be able to contribute right away. And to be honest, that's what Florida needs on the defensive line. They need guys who are going to step in when they're young, play 15, 20 snaps as freshmen, play 40 or 50 snaps when they become sophomores and juniors, and hopefully gone after 3 years in the NFL because they played well. And Collins has that kind of profile. He again fits the profile of guys Napier's brought in, where when you look at the recruiting rankings, there's a big split between some of the rankings at the composite ranking and some of the overall rankings. So 24/7 has him 173rd nationally, but the 24/7 composite, which is an amalgam of all the rankings, has him at 70. That means somebody's got him at like 20, right? So the question is, which one is he? And one of those sites is going to be right. And we'll see. So this has been sort of the Napier's got a lot of guys in sort of the 100, 120, 180 range, and this has been one of the sort of signatures of those sorts of things, is having guys who look like they're very, very high upside candidates, and Collins is another one of those.
Well, we know if Alabama and Georgia wants his services too, we know they know what they're doing along the defensive front. So, I mean, we haven't had too many of these head-to-head wins like this on the trail, Will, compared to where we were at the end of June. I really think this is a pretty incredible turnaround here in a couple months for Billy Napier and company on the recruiting trail.
Well, I mean, it's a turnaround for you because you were about to jump off a cliff 2 months ago.
I was not happy with where we were.
Well, I mean, nor should you have been, but the issue is that you always get this in June and July, and even August to some extent. You get these types of signings, which is why you really shouldn't look at a class in terms of where it is overall until you've pretty much gotten all the way through the summer. So I've always said August 1st is a good time to start looking at the class because it's going to start to take hold. Now, Florida's signed a bunch of guys recently, or gotten a lot of guys committed. Hasn't signed anybody yet. Gotten a lot of guys committed recently, who are like I said, that the highest guy on the board, and they keep subsequently doing that. Now they need to keep doing that, right? Because having the 70th ranked player is great, but you need a few guys who are 5th and 10th and 12th and that sort of stuff. And we'll get to that in a few minutes. But, look, great addition on the defensive line for Collins. Obviously, we're going to talk about the next guy on the defensive line too. Big addition as well. And so Napier's building not only with elite recruits, but he's building with guys at positions of need. And that's an important thing.
Yeah, you talk about all the time too about viewing each of these players as kind of like a lottery ticket. And the more lottery tickets you have, the more you have a chance to hit. Another great addition coming in here, defensive lineman Will Norman, 6'4", 276 pounds, currently plays at IMG High School in Bradenton. Another IMG product. Will chose Florida over Auburn, LSU, Penn State, Tennessee, and Texas A&M. According to 24/7 Sports, Norman did not start playing football till his freshman year of high school at St. Thomas More in Oakdale, Connecticut. So this is a guy that probably still has a little more to learn in terms of when he gets to the college level, in terms of his form, his mechanics, everything else. Big guy like that, 6'4", 276. Obviously, probably getting some good coaching there at IMG Academy as well, Will, but seems like a guy that would have room to develop if he's learning to play football that late in his career here. Norman told On3, I'm closest with Coach Napier, Coach Spencer, and also Coach Chaney, as well as the whole D-line room. I look forward to being used similar to how they are currently using Gervon Dexter, showing versatility as an interior defensive lineman. So this is a guy that seems like he's going to be able to play on the inside, going to probably add even more size here. Again, 6'4", 276 going into that senior year. Will Norman, big pickup along this defensive front. You mentioned the defensive front being a weakness in the last few years. It's going to look a lot different a year or two from now based on what we're seeing on the recruiting trail.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there's a couple things here. Obviously, now you've got two guys in the top 160, 170, actually 150 who are defensive linemen. So, I think the last time they did that was the last time they got guys like that was probably when they had Darrell Slayton and Elijah Conliffe back in, what would that have been, 2015, 2016. So, look, Slayton worked out sort of, played 4 years and was a solid contributor. Conliffe was injured and couldn't really contribute all that much. So, look, I don't want to get out the pom-poms and say this is going to be an awesome defensive line from the start. But again, to your point, you're likely one of these two guys is going to work out as a major contributor. Maybe both of them do, but likely. But the odds say one of the two is going to turn into a significant contributor, which means you're going to get good play up front, which is something that Florida hasn't had now in 4 or 5 years. Really been having to raid the transfer portal just to sort of plug the holes there. The other thing, and I think this is an important point, you mentioned IMG. That's now 3 players from IMG. You've got Norman, you've got Kamari Wilson, and you've got Najee Harris on the offensive line from IMG. And you think about Wilson, it was okay. Well, is Wilson going to be able to convince these guys to come up from IMG? And now you've got 2 guys this class coming up from IMG, and IMG has 5 5-star candidates in the 2024 class. So from the standpoint of having guys on campus who are going to be able to recruit the guys who are already at IMG, Napier has been able to sort of set up that pipeline too. Because look, when it's silent time and the Florida coaches can't reach out to those guys, Kamari Wilson's still going to be texting his friends. Will Norman's still going to be texting his friends, right? And so there is a connection and a communication and a camaraderie that you can build with a school just by bringing in the guys who are already there. So beyond just the fact that Norman's a really good player and that he's 146th ranked overall, and beyond the fact that Kamari Wilson's a really good player, ranked, I think 44th overall last year, beyond all of that, you now have set a foundation to communicate to a school that churns out 5-star candidates. Like I said, 5 5-star candidates in the 2024 class. Florida isn't going to get all 5, but maybe they get 1 or 2 of them. And that sort of sets your baseline for those elite prospects that we all know we need in order to win. And that'll all be because of the groundwork that's been laid with Norman and Wilson and with Najee Harris.
In one of the articles I read, Norman had said that he feels confident that he can step in and get playing time early at Florida. That was one of the things that appealed to him about coming up to Florida.
I mean, I think he'd get playing time this year if he was around. I mean, that's which is both good and bad, right? I mean, there's a lot to sell on the defensive line in terms of playing time and your ability to get out there, and that's probably a bad sign for 2022. But in terms of what Florida's trying to build and bringing in the kinds of players they need to bring in, obviously there's going to be playing time available, but there's also going to be competition. And so it's not going to be, Norman's coming in the same class with someone who's ranked higher than him, and their size profiles are fairly similar. So these are guys, obviously they're going to rotate and that sort of stuff, but there's going to be competition. And so you've got 2 guys who are coming in clearly don't mind the competition, and we'll see what they can do.
Another commitment along the defensive line from Orlando Olympia, 6'5", 265 pounds. If you haven't watched the highlight tape, strongly encourage you to go on YouTube, pull up the highlights for Cameron James. What a beast. This guy just breaks through. There's a couple highlights where he is just throwing people around. He just throws people around. Had a blast watching his tape. Will, he chose Florida over Georgia, Alabama, Auburn, Miami, LSU, and Florida State.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, that's been the list of everybody pretty recently, right? I mean, everybody pretty recently has had those options and could have gone somewhere other than Gainesville. We're not competing against, UMass for these guys who are coming in. It's the big boys of the SEC that Florida's competing with and winning. I think it's interesting. It was funny because you talk about the highlight tapes. You had me Google it before we came on because I hadn't had a chance to watch it. He looks like he's chasing down Pop Warner guys.
It's ridiculous.
It's just he gets to the quarterback. The quarterback's like a foot shorter than he is. I mean, I was sitting there. I had to look it up. I'm like, is he 7 feet tall? What's going on here? It's like, no, he's just
looks like a created character in a video game.
He's just a big dude. But again, this all fits within that profile, right? You got Collins, you've got Norman. You've got James now. You've also got TJ Searcy, Isaiah Nixon, and Gavin Hill, all guys up front, all top 300 recruits. In fact, within the top 256, I think Hill is 263. Hill's 263. So all within the top 263, you've got 6 guys on the defensive line who are a big part of this class, right? So when you talk about the defensive line looking different and you talk about lottery tickets, any one of these guys could turn into an elite player. Any one of them can wash out, but all 6 are not. So Florida's defensive line a year or 2 from now is going to look very formidable for the SEC. You're going to have these guys rotating in and out. Obviously, the transfer portal has a little bit to say about depth and those sorts of things. And so, you do need to watch out. You don't just want to bring in a bunch of guys in one class and not be able to bring a bunch in the next. But in terms of where Florida has a need and the quality of players they're bringing in, this is a pretty big deal.
Yeah, especially considering the conversations we've had the last two off seasons about what the depth's like, especially in the middle of that defensive line. So very much looking forward. If we didn't add another name to this defensive line class, I think it's satisfactory. However, there are some names out there that we we may still add. So I again, the 2 month swing here from where we were at the end of June to where we are today, almost best case scenario from in just 2 months. Will an incredible job by Napier and his staff, and I realize they've had a lot of events. You talk about the natural timeline of things, but when we were looking at it, we just weren't getting the commitments weren't falling in the early part of the summer. Whatever they're doing since the end of June, unbelievable work.
Yeah, well, some of it's timing. I mean, some of these guys said, "Hey, we're going to announce in late July," right? And in fact, we were a little bit disappointed at those point, because Malik Bryant and Derek LeBlanc and those sorts of guys, Peyton Kirkland decided to go elsewhere. But obviously, they have backup plans, and in some cases, these guys aren't backup plans. These were the targets that they actually wanted as well, and they've been able to bring these guys in and close the deal. A guy like Marcus Stokes, who's 385th overall, but the quarterback, that's the backup plan really for Jaden Rashada. Well, you missed out on Rashada, but you were able to very quickly pivot and move to the next spot so that you fill that roster spot on a yearly basis. And at a quarterback position, I think that's really critical. The other thing is that, look, we've known for a fairly long time that Will Norman's coming to Gainesville. I mean, all the writing's been on the tea leaves. We've known everything he said has been Florida. All the crystal balls have been Florida. Anybody with any sort of inside information has said, yeah, he's solid to Florida. It's just a matter of when and those sorts of things. So Norman's really sort of been in the fold for an extended period of time here. As the reporters don't necessarily want to ruin his news, so you never know exactly when that's going to happen. But he's been in the fold. So when you think about Napier and how he's planning and how that staff's planning, they probably had a bunch of these guys basically already with a check mark next to it. It just hadn't been publicly announced. Now, that doesn't help the marketing, right? I mean, because when Florida's struggled with recruiting, for a decade now, and Napier comes in saying talent acquisition, well, hey, where is the talent acquisition? Now we're starting to see it. And it's interesting. Florida's overall class is at 91.5 now. If they can add some really high class guys. So if they add Cormani McClain, Dijon Johnson, Jordan Hall, Tamarian Parker, the Penn State decommit, and DeQuavius Sori, they'll end up at 92.3, which would have historically put them at 5th or 6th. Now I think they're going to end up short of that for two reasons. One is the recruiting classes are a little bit top heavy this year. And the other is that there just aren't a whole lot of 5-star elite guys left in the fold other than McClain. And so, the odds that they bring in a second or a third 5-star, I think are pretty low, though actually getting better this week. So, look, I think if you look at historically what Dan Mullen and Jim McElwain have done, it was somewhere between 3.5 to 4 players a year that you would expect based on the recruiting profiles we're going to end up in the NFL. This year, Napier's going to be up over 5. At the end of the year, he's probably going to have more. We will expect 5 players to come out of this class. Now, does that happen? A lot of that has to do with development, right? It's going to be development, how many of them transfer, all those sorts of things. But at the end of the day, it's a better class than the one that his predecessors put together. It's not as good as Alabama. It's not as good as Georgia. It's not as good as Texas A&M will be. It's not as good as Ohio State. So there's still another level to go, but it's a heck of a lot better than it has been, and we should be excited about the guys who are coming to Gainesville.
More on that here in 4 bits. Let's talk about Jaden Robinson, the linebacker from Lake City, Florida, 6'1", 220 pounds, Columbia High School product, was at the school at University of Florida for Friday Night Lights in July here, allowed the Gators to really go to work and really secure, continue to pitch him after he committed to South Carolina. Bateman, Mike Peterson, and Cheney were the coaches that helped reel Robinson in, and he's the first linebacker to commit in the 2023 class. Will.
Yeah, well, this is actually one of those that I think sort of goes back to those players like Bryant in terms of backups and backup plans and those sorts of things. He wasn't offered by Florida till July 3rd. Mm-hmm. July 4th, he commits to South Carolina. And, a month and a half later, he's now flipping from South Carolina and coming to Florida. So the staff clearly made him a priority when they realized they weren't going to get Malik Bryant and decided, hey, let's go after Jaden Robinson. We need to fill that spot at the linebacker. Now, he's not just a filler, right? I mean, he's the 380th ranked player overall, the 31st linebacker in the class. guys like Antonio Morrison, that's kind of the profile of somebody like Jaden Robinson in terms of just where they sit in the recruiting rankings. So it's not, again, this is one of those where you go, hey, it's not as though he's going to be um, this isn't just like a backup where they brought in a guy who's ranked 800th, like we were watching with the Mullen and the McElwain regimes. This is a guy they'd spent a lot of time on, figured out that he was going to be somebody who can step in and make a difference. I mean, look, 24/7 has him as a Power 5 starter. Those are valuable guys, right?
Mm-hmm.
If you get a guy who can be a Power 5 starter, and really it almost even comes down to the number of years you can be a Power 5 starter. If he can come in and be a 3-year Power 5 starter, that's an extraordinarily valuable pickup, whether he turns into a star or not. And we'll see. I mean, 3 interceptions in 2022 with a sack and a forced fumble means he's around the ball. Also means he has pretty good hands, and means you can probably use him in coverage. And you think about what Patrick Toney and Billy Napier want on defense. They want to be able to send a corner and drop a linebacker. They want to be able to send a safety and drop a linebacker. And so if if Robinson can do that, then he's going to open up some options on the defensive side of the ball for the coordinators.
Shane Beamer has one last 4-star linebacker from North Florida. I like it. Miles Graham, son of Ernest Graham Will, product of Atlanta Woodward Academy, 6'1", 212 pounds, had offers from Alabama, Ohio State, Georgia, Notre Dame, Texas A&M, and Texas. Commits to the Gators, says he loves the swamp. It's always been a great place for him. He said this to On3. Coach Bateman, he obviously coaches my position. He's really not a coach that's going to get on you and cuss you out. He's going to get on you when he needs to, but always be there for you and be by your side and give you his best at all times. High praise for Coach Bateman there from a legacy commit. Will Miles Graham also first commit, gets the class of 2024 off to a good start for the Gators. Highly athletic. His tape looks great. He also plays some running back there up in Atlanta. And looking forward to having him on campus, although he's got another couple years here. Going into his junior year of high school right now.
I mean, but look, that's what you see all the big boys doing. The big boys set a stake in the ground and say, we're going to set our class really, really early. And, it's hard to do in the bump class. You don't expect it in the bump class to do that early, which is why you sit there and wait until July and August to start evaluating it. But Graham's higher ranked than anybody that Florida has in the 2023 class right now. He's ranked 52nd overall, high-level 4-star candidate at a position of need, again, at linebacker. Florida's going to need some linebackers, especially with Ventrell Miller and Amari Burney leaving after this year. Yes, he's a legacy. That does take a little bit of the shine off of the recruiting win. But, let's be honest. Just because you're a legacy doesn't mean you come to Florida. Things have to be right. And so to bring in Miles Graham, to have him here 2 years early, to have him heading up that class, to lock down a guy who's played in Florida, for, Woodward Academies in Atlanta, but again, the guy who's from Florida, to lock down the state. That's what you have to do. You have to bring in the guys who are close to you, draw that circle around Gainesville and bring those guys in. Top 50 guys who are in that circle around Gainesville are going to be welcome anytime, and you can build a class with that. So very, very encouraging to see that the first commit for this 2024 class is in that elite tier where we need the recruits to be next year. There need to be 3, 4, 5-star candidates. And Graham has a possibility of working his way up in there if he has a good year this year. But even if he just stays where he is right now, a elite prospect, somebody who's got significant chances of making it to the NFL. And so we expect him to contribute early when he gets there.
Yeah. And also a good way to make, guys like us in their late 30s and early 40s feel super old that Ernest Graham's son is now coming to play football at the University of Florida.
I played baseball against Ernest Graham in high school. So, I ripped one into the gap and thought I had a shirt double, and he got under it like it was a can of corn. And, I went, oh, that guy's a professional athlete. I'm not. So, Ernest has always been my favorite player. I mean, he and I end up showing up to Florida at the same time. Play when he was with Mariner, I'm at Fort Myers High School playing against him. It's just sort of a fun thing to have a guy you played against playing for the Gators while you're at Florida. So he's always been my favorite. So it's cool to have his kid going there, though. Again, it should make me feel old, but I have a 13-year-old daughter, so she makes me feel old. So it's
just another reason to make you feel old.
Yeah, How about
that? All right.
He just started a little bit earlier compared to me. Man, he's already got a kid coming to college. It's
well, he knew Billy Napier needed it in the class of 2024, getting off to a good start. One more thing here before we go on to 6 bits. 5-star defensive end Keon Keeley of Berkeley Prep in the Tampa area. He's decommitted from Notre Dame. Been committed for quite a while to the Irish. He was their first commit, as a matter of fact, to the class of 2023. He did commit to the previous staff, and the defensive line coach now at Michigan. Obviously, we know where Brian Kelly and his family are now, down in the Bayou. Only 5-star in Notre Dame's class. And as a junior, he had 34 tackles for a loss, 16 and a half sacks. And it's thought that he's leaning toward Alabama. I saw some Richard Young tweets, the running back from Naples who's committed to Alabama, saying, we're going to flip him to Bama. I'm going to get it done. But he's made 2 trips to Tuscaloosa since January. But the 6'6", 230-pound prospect is also considering Ohio State and Florida. Will, even if he is leaning toward Alabama, the fact that he's decommitted from Notre Dame and he's back on the board, great news for Billy Napier and the staff here, and solid opportunity here. You talk about not a lot of 5-stars being in play. This guy's been off the board for quite a while on paper. Like, it's great to have him back in the mix to at least have a shot at him.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely, right? I mean, he's a guy that we've heard rumblings about ever since Napier took over, where, hey, this might be a flip candidate, which is interesting. Again, you mentioned the staff, who he'd committed to, that sort of stuff. And so it was always sort of looked at as, hey, this might be somebody who can commit. And the guy's from Florida, right? He's from Tampa. So you think about a guy who's from Florida, decides he's going to have to find a new staff and build a relationship with anyway. I suspect Florida spent a lot of time talking to him and texting him and making sure he knows they want him. But then the other thing is, if he goes to Alabama, there are other guys who might then take a second look someplace else. And believe me, if you've got a guy who wants to go to Alabama who will take a second look at Florida, then that's valuable too. So it's not just necessarily, can you get Keon Keeley to come to Florida? It's, are there guys who are considering Alabama? A guy like Qua Russell, who's ranked 28th overall from Montgomery, Alabama, but he's an edge rusher, right? 28th overall, but now he's going to come in with Keeley, and he's going to come in with some of the other 5-star candidates that Alabama has coming in. Does he want that competition? Is he going to do that? And again, I don't have any inside information here. I'm just saying, like, those are the kinds of things you could look at and say, is there a cascading effect when you've got a guy like Keeley on the board? Does that open up an opportunity? Does it open up sort of a door to then go talk to somebody else who may have said, I'm going to go there? And now all of a sudden there's some competition. And so you've got an opportunity. And again, maybe he doesn't even end up at Alabama, right? Maybe he goes to LSU and ends up going with the staff that he had decided he wanted to go with originally. But the fact that he's coming and having conversations with Alabama, does that open up an opportunity then for Florida to talk to those guys who maybe where Alabama leans and say, look, they're going to replace you with somebody better. Come here. We need you here. That sort of stuff. There's going to be playing time, all that stuff we talked about with the defensive line earlier. So I'm interested to see what happens. Obviously, I think if he brings in Keeley, that completely changes the dynamics of this entire recruiting class, because now you're starting to hit real metrics for bump classes. I mean, Keeley assuming McClain comes, Keeley puts him at 2 5-star candidates, 2 top 10 candidates. Definitely gets them in a range where they're starting to bring in the same number of top 60 candidates as some of these transition classes tended to have. It also puts you with some of the other guys we're talking about. It starts putting you in like the 17, 18, 19 players who are in the top 300. The blue chips is a little bit overrated thus far. I mean, there's 18 blue chips, but only 12 of them are in the top 300. And so there's 6 guys sort of on that lower end. But if you can bring in high end talent, Keeley changes the perspective. So, look, I look at it and say, he's a Tampa guy. The door's open. What can you do with it now that the door's open? And, people have been talking, I'm not sure that I bought it that much, but people have been talking that, Florida's sort of saving up the NIL dollars. There's, other people are already blowing the NIL dollars, and the collective will be there when there are guys who decide they want to switch late. Well, now you've got that opportunity. So if there's a bullet in the chamber, now's the time to use it and, bring in that second 5-star candidate and really get a difference maker on the defensive line.
Great opportunity for the staff here. Ohio State, Alabama, definitely formidable on the trail, though. So we'll see how that goes with Keon Keeley. Let's go on to 6 bits. We'll cover news and notes from camp here. First question, Will, I got to start with the Ricky Pearsall foot injury. At first, there's a lot of concern, but not terrible news, right? on that one.
I mean, so it's better than it could have been, right? I mean, when you first heard that he had a foot injury, you're like, oh no, is it like an Achilles? Is it a high ankle sprain? Like, what is it? And but anytime you get a soft tissue injury in the foot, it's something you got to be concerned about. It's sort of like whenever you hear a wrist injury in baseball for a hitter, you go, oh no. And it's not necessarily because the wrist injury is like the most serious thing in the world. Is because when guys come back from wrist injuries, they still don't necessarily play all that well because the wrist is weak and it takes them a little while to get back in the swing of things. And to be honest, one of the positives out of camp is that Brenton Cox looks like he's just absolutely excelling in the new scheme. And it's money making time for him. This is last year, and he's gonna have to prove to NFL scouts what he can do. But if you think about it, last year coming into camp, there were reports that he had injured a foot. And, he got off to a pretty slow start. And there was the Alabama game where I think he played pretty well. But other than that, it was very inconsistent. And then when you got to the end of the year for Cox, all of a sudden he was a monster. I mean, the game against Florida State, I think he had 4 sacks, but it's more than just that. You start looking at his actual game logs and the last 3 games. So he had a tackle for loss and a sack with 5 total tackles against Missouri. He had 4 sacks, 4 tackles for loss, 5 total tackles against Florida State. He had 4 tackles for loss and a sack against Central Florida. So, and before that, he had a sack against Samford, which really doesn't count. And then he had a sack against Alabama. So you think about where he excelled, it was towards the end of the year. That's my concern about Pearsall. Is I do think that we're going to have to give him some time. He's probably not going to come out and put up an 8 catch for 140-yard performance against Utah, even if he's out there and able to play. I think we're going to have to lean on the guys who, maybe we were hoping would be complementary to Pearsall, but guys like Justin Shorter and guys like Xavier Henderson are going to have to step up, because chances are it's going to take him a little while to get back from this, be 100%, be fully ready to go and cut. And I mean, he's a slot receiver, right? So, it's always possible that could be re-injured. And, you don't want it to be nagging. So you really kind of need to give him the time to heal. So not ideal, obviously, to have him hurt, but it was something he hurt like the first day in camp and then exacerbated a week later. So it's one of those things where it's like, all right, let's just make sure he's good. And if he's not good until Tennessee, or if he's not good until LSU, wait until he's good. And, you just got to sacrifice until then, because you don't want it to be nagging all year long.
Speaking of overcoming injuries in the passing game, the tight end position, Will, huge point of concern this spring. Seeing a lot of positive news about Dante Sanders coming out of camp. You see, I've heard McDowell's slimmed down a little bit. He's moving around a little quicker. Any other big items? Odom's back practicing, not getting hit though, and Elksness is back on the field, right? Any other big points of concern or at the tight end position here?
I mean, I think the big thing is just Sanders and Zipper are going to be on the field a lot. And so, Sanders looked great in the spring game. Zipper was a little bit, now he was working with Jack Miller, not with Anthony Richardson. And so there were some disadvantages there, but the reality is Zipper was one of those guys that we all thought was going to be outstanding and was going to be one of these guys who could be a difference maker. And he's been a contributor, but he has not been a difference maker. And so that's going to be the question is, are there any difference makers? The fact that Sanders has made his way up to being in the top 1 or top 2 of the tight ends is an awesome story, right? I mean, this is a guy who, when Napier was announced he was coming in, went into the transfer portal. Napier convinces him to come back. They move him to tight end because of injuries, but he was originally recruited at tight end. It turns out he's pretty good at it. And now all of a sudden he's somebody who might be an indispensable part. I mean, that's a really cool story, but it also says something about the other guys at tight end. But I still think that the one thing I will say is, and I'll be interested to see how Napier uses this. So he, in his press conference, said something that I think was really, really important. And that was that he had 8 offensive linemen that he can trust. And there haven't been 8 offensive linemen in Gainesville that any coach could trust in about a decade. So if he's got 8 guys he can trust, does that mean he starts bringing in 6 offensive linemen and a tight end instead of going too tight? Right? That if his goal is to have a guy who can block, do you just go larger, have a guy who's not necessarily a threat to catch the ball, and go with extra offensive linemen because your tight ends, maybe one of them is a pass specialist, maybe one of them isn't necessarily great at blocking on the edge. And if you've got 8 offensive linemen, do you bring in that 6th guy to deal with it? I'm curious to see what he does. I think that might be an adjustment that they make in the Napier offense this year, is trying to get a little bit more girth up front. And we saw it in the, or at least we heard reports of it from scrimmage. The running backs were ripping big runs left and right. I mean, Lingard had a big long one. Even ETN had a long one in practice, and basically every running back was was ripping these long runs. Now we all remember LSU ripping long runs last year against the Florida defense, so this is always one of those fall camp conundrums of, is it the defense isn't any good, or is it that the offense is really really good? But the offensive line news, I think, is something that should be welcome. In 2017, I remember all the reports out of camp going, "Oh, defensive line's dominating. Must be because the defense is going to step up." And we're all sitting there going, or it could be the offensive line isn't going to be any good. And sure enough, against Michigan, we saw that pretty definitively there in that first game. So good to know that there's 8 guys. And what that really means is when somebody screws up, there will not be a Kentucky game, or there should not be a Kentucky game where you've got 8 false starts. Not because you don't have a player who would jump that much, but because if in fact there's a player who's jumping, he's going to come off the field because there's somebody to replace him. And, you remember a couple years ago in 2020 against LSU, Delance was not playing very well. They took him out. I think they put Tarquin out at right tackle. But the fumble that sort of changed the complexion of the game at the end of the first half was with Delance on the bench, right? So they tried to bench him, and the replacement wasn't any better and didn't make things any better. And hopefully that changes this year.
Bold take from Will Miles that the Florida Gators will not have a game where they have 8 false starts in a single game this year. That's a big improvement, though. That is a big improvement from what we saw last year. Any other points of concern? Looking at the defensive backfield, Will, you're hearing things about the young guys, Moore, Wilson contributing early potentially. Any other news and notes from the secondary?
I mean, Moore's the guy that I think is critical there, is that, he comes in as a true freshman. He's pushing for starting time, which says something about his ability and says something about the scheme specifically. The defensive backfield got a bunch of interceptions in the scrimmage, and it was not just Jack Miller throwing interceptions. Richardson apparently had 2 in relatively limited time. One of them was tipped, so you don't know, was he trying to force it in? Was it something that got tipped at the line of scrimmage? Those sorts of things. But again, the defensive backfield for Florida was pretty good last year. So, obviously Kyrie Elam's leaving, but he was injured a lot last year and was playing, but was not necessarily 100% after that Alabama game. Jason Marshall is going to take another step forward. You've got Torrance, and you've got, who's Johnson. You got Trevez Johnson, and you got Torrance back there at safety, and you got Dean. And now all of a sudden, if you got a guy like Moore and even Wilson a little bit who can contribute, you're going extraordinarily deep in the defensive backfield. You have the ability to rotate people in and out. I think Florida's going to be really good against the pass. The big question for this team is going to be defensive line, the ability to hold up against the run. And so again, this is one of those things where camp news is interesting because the running backs are ripping all these long runs. Are they ripping the long runs because the defensive line is struggling, or are they ripping it because the offensive line is powerful and is announcing its presence of authority? And the good news is we'll find out, right? I mean, if those long runs materialize against Utah, we'll know that the offensive line was for real. If they're getting stuffed 2 yards behind the line of scrimmage, we'll know it's because Florida didn't have any defensive tackles in camp.
Yeah, obviously we're taking a guess at this year, but how often do you expect to see Shamar James this year, the freshman linebacker out of Alabama?
I think we're going to see him quite a bit. Maybe not in the Utah game extensively, but I think we're going to see him. And the reason is I was talking to Dave on Gators Breakdown about this the other day, which is that the last time Florida had a linebacker with middle linebacker instincts was David Reese. And Reese started as a freshman there in 2017, right? He was one of the leaders when everything started to fall apart. And I think that there's an opportunity for James to do that because James is going to have some of those instincts. Now, Wingo hopefully has some of those instincts as well. But we've seen the last couple of years, Hopper didn't seem to have those. And Diabate was a guy who was hand in the ground, rushing off the edge that they tried to turn into a linebacker. And, he was trying as hard as he could, but didn't have those instincts either. And Ventrell Miller has slimmed down a little bit and maybe is going to be able to get sideline to sideline. But, we saw him against Najee Harris for Alabama, just, sideline to sideline, not being able to keep up. So having a guy like James, who's skilled, who can be a 3-down linebacker is going to be critical to Florida moving forward. How much can he do it early on this year? I think it's probably going to be pretty limited. I think you may need him by the time you get to the LSU, Georgia, A&M stretch. And that won't be too outside of the scope of things. I mean, look, Brandon Spikes was a guy who didn't start immediately as a true freshman, but was a huge part of that 2006 team the 2006 team, because of the injuries that occurred at middle linebacker. He had to come in and play. And I suspect that that's probably, if James is playing a lot, that's probably because people have gotten injured. But I think his instincts are going to allow him to succeed if he gets in there.
All right. That's some news and notes from camp so far to this point. We'll move on to a dollar. Will, I'm not sure how many of you have seen this, but we'll play it right now. Will, it just feels wrong. There's nothing about that feels right. Looking at that, I watch plenty. This comes from a guy. I watch plenty of Big Ten football throughout the year. Okay, I watch plenty of Big Ten football, and seeing that SEC music with the Big Ten in the backdrop, it just doesn't make any sense to me, man.
Yeah. I mean, it's going to feel very similar when Michigan chokes on CBS again, just like they do whenever they play an SEC team. So, we'll get around to it at some point, but they do need to change the theme song if they're going to change conferences, because, let's be honest, how excited can you get for like Rutgers and Maryland and Indiana? They're jumping up and down. It's like, you guys have like 6 Vanderbilts.
I have some good news then for you, Will, because the Big Ten is going to get plenty of national spotlight here. The Big Ten has agreed to a new TV deal. It'll pay out over $1 billion on an annual basis. Over $1 billion, Will. 7-year agreement with Fox, FS1, CBS, NBC, and the Big Ten Network. It'll take the Big Ten through the 2029-2030 season. CBS and NBC are each paying around $350 million per year for the Big Ten packages. The Big Ten new rights agreement are worth more than $8 billion over a 7-year term, sources told The Athletic this week. The largest rights deal ever for a collegiate athletic conference here. Each contract is for 7 years for each of the networks, which means the Big Ten will go to market again before the SEC's new contract with ESPN. I'm not going to get into every single little detail here, but basically, Fox keeps the Big Ten's premier game. They're going to do the noon slot. Starting in 2024, CBS will broadcast a Big Ten game at 3:30, and then the night at primetime slot, NBC is going to do another primetime game. So 3 primetime games on 3 national television channels there for the Big Ten every Saturday. Pretty incredible stuff there. And if you want to compare to what the Big Ten is going to be pulling in annually to the SEC, a little over $1 billion a year for the Big Ten. ESPN's exclusive 10-year deal with the SEC starts in 2024, 2025. It's believed to be in the $300 million per year range. That deal includes both the 3:30 p.m. kickoff and primetime windows for the conference's premier games. That one's through ESPN, Will. Again, no more Big Ten on the ESPN starting the 2023-2024 season here. It's going to be a little bit different in college football, but CBS basically said as soon as the deal with the SEC fell through, they wanted to jump in and target the Big Ten right away. So the Big Ten, Fox, NBC, CBS, we haven't seen a deal like this, but I think it bodes well for what's coming down the road with the SEC, although they have a 10-year contract that they've yet to start. So the Big Ten will get a double dip before the SEC goes back to the drawing board here.
Yeah, I mean, we'll see. I think the ACC really hedged themselves in with the TV deal they have, just in terms of the way it works and sort of the fact that the revenues stay with the conference even if teams leave, and so that contract was set up to be prohibitive to sort of the reorganization within college football. The Big Ten doesn't have that problem, or at least they didn't. I don't know what the fine print on this deal says. The SEC definitely doesn't have that. The other thing that this doesn't factor in is that the SEC pretty much owns the SEC network, and so the money that the SEC generates from the TV deal is not just the $300 and something million a year that they get from the payout for ESPN for their primetime games, but also all the advertising revenue and all the stuff that's associated with the SEC network as well. And you think about the value of the SEC network versus the value of the Big Ten network, and they're not even close. And so I suspect these deals are probably close, though the SEC is going to come in a little bit less. I also don't know what kind of escalator clauses there might be in the SEC deal, right? I mean, you get these, you think about like football where they announced some guy signed a $200 million contract, but it's really only $20 million guaranteed. And I don't know how much of like what kind of advertising windows there are open for the SEC, but this further exemplifies that these deals are not going to go to completion. The Big Ten and the SEC are going to work together to form some sort of league that then bargains with these television entities for just a massive deal sometime in the next 4, 5, 6 years. That's what's coming. And, the question will be, what do they need to do to get out of these? What are the legal ramifications of all this stuff? Heck, maybe we get the CBS, the SEC on CBS song back because because CBS wins the deal when these things all combine. But I suspect really what we're setting up here is the AFC and the NFC, right? That the AFC is on one channel, the NFC is on the other. There's a special game of the week on NBC, and ESPN has the Monday nighter that's usually like Browns versus the Jaguars, and nobody cares. And that's sort of what this sounds like. The only thing that's missing really from this deal is I was expecting them to announce that they were going to host one of the games on True TV, because that seems to be the CBS special there. Like,
well, don't worry, they got Peacock. Some of the games are going to be on Peacock.
Oh God. That is interesting. It's interesting who that'll bring to the table, though, because if NBC is really ponying up for this, then is the Notre Dame property going down in value when you consider or is it going up in value when you consider the way these conferences are aligning and starting to put the dollars together? Wouldn't surprise me. Notre Dame's going to join one of these two conferences in the not too distant future. When they do, that's going to trigger all sorts of renegotiation. So the numbers are staggering. I mean, they're enormous. It also then sort of lends it makes it a little bit weird to feel like the boosters have to pay for these players when you're bringing in $1 billion a year for your conference, like to have NIL and oh yeah, like we need another $3 million for this guy. And everybody's like, he made $9 million on his NIL deal. How dare he? It's like, yeah, Indiana is going to get a payout of like $100 million a year. And Indiana sucks. Like that program hasn't won anything in years, and they're going to get this enormous payout. And then none of that goes to the players. So things are changing. They're going to change. This is actually probably going to be the impetus for change, because I do think this will sort of push the SEC into figuring out what's next. I mean, the SEC has been pretty content to sit there, but this is a major overbid for the teams that they're actually getting when you compare it to what ESPN just paid for the SEC. And, it'll be interesting. I mean, the inflation for the pricing on football, NFL and college, has just been going and going and going and going. And you sort of wait for the bubble to burst, but it just hasn't burst yet. And, DVR proof content is king right now. We'll see if it continues that way. But, look, it's an exciting time for college football, but it's also a little bit of a trepidatious time, right? Because it's a question of, you don't know where everybody's sort of going around the playing duck, duck, goose. And at some point the chairs are going to fill up and who's going to get left out. And the good news is it'll probably be Indiana or Rutgers or Vanderbilt or somebody like that. Florida's going to be in the thick of wherever the smoke clears, the Gators are going to be in position to take advantage. But and none of this money can be used for NIL. So, it doesn't put you at a recruiting
Yet.
advantage or disadvantage or anything like that. So
None of it can be used for NIL yet. We
yeah,
can
well,
we might get there eventually, and that's where you talk about the impact with the SEC here. I mean, it's interesting to see what the potential schedules could be. I mean, you're looking at three CBS, Fox, NBC, nationally televised game every single week. That's a pretty big deal because I'm looking at the Big Ten slate. And you think about how many weeks does the Big Ten have three games that the whole nation's desperate to watch? Although those games would appear on ESPN, that's not really that much different, I suppose, in a way, these days. But what I was thinking in terms of the SEC, you're talking about if the Big Ten is almost lapping you year to year on how much each of their teams are making, and they get to go back to the well before you even get to negotiate your contract once. That's gonna be tough. I do like what you said though, because we're already seeing rumblings about this today, aren't we? We mentioned it before the show. You and I were talking about it a little bit, where there's a little bit of talk that college football playoff is already kind of hinting at the fact that they want to break off and kind of do their own thing from the NCAA with just the college football playoff. And I think that is the direction we're ultimately heading with college football. So that's why I don't get too worked up about all these changes and everything yet, because I do think we're in for a world of change still, even though the foundations are shaking, there's earthquakes everywhere. I don't think things are settling down anytime soon.
Nah. And look, I mean, where are the best players? The Southeast. Where are the most prestigious programs? The Southeast. No one believes that the Big Ten is a property that's twice as valuable as the SEC. And if the SEC goes to their media partners and says, we need to reopen negotiations, I don't doubt that they're going to do it, because what'll happen is that the SEC will strategically add teams to get to a point where they can break their contract and then renegotiate. So they are going to negotiate this contract before the 10 years is up, whether it's a good faith negotiation, whether it's something in the contract that where there's an escalator clause where ESPN basically has to match whatever the Big Ten gets, whether it's, that, they divest of teams, whether it's they bring in teams, whatever it is. Believe me, the SEC has a plan to be able to take advantage of this and stay on top. And the big thing is that they just have the best teams. And, yes, the money in the Big Ten can be used, maybe will be able to be used for NIL. But again, if you don't think that if money from TV deals can be used for recruiting, then that's going to open up a whole different can of worms as well, and a whole different set of renegotiations as well. And so, look, I don't think anybody who's in the SEC is quaking in their boots. I think you need to pay attention to it. The Big Ten is clearly making moves, and building a war chest and trying to go head to head and toe to toe with the SEC. But, they're also led by a bunch of people who tried to cancel the season in 2020. So, at the end of the day, I'm going to put my money on the guys who said, no, we're playing, come hell or high water, we are playing, and tough noogies to everybody else out there. We're going to play, and, sort of goaded them into doing it. I trust that leadership to be able to make its way through the changing landscape more than I do the folks who are sort of reactionary. And look, this is an enormous deal. And you mentioned the 3 different games, but spreading yourself over different channels, I don't know, right? I mean, you think about what the SEC has done over the past 2 decades, like that SEC game of the week, 3:30 every weekend. That's where it's going to be, is on CBS. Vern was a part of our lives forever, right? Gary Danielson still ticks off everybody when he does an Alabama game because of how enthralled he is by whoever's playing for Saban. And those things are like cultural to the SEC. Are you going to be able to replicate that with, Ohio State, Indiana? I mean, the reality is that game probably isn't any worse than Alabama, Arkansas, but Alabama, Arkansas is going to draw way more eyes than Ohio State and Indiana. That's just the way it is. And, hey, I'm looking forward to that old Oaken Bucket Purdue Indiana game at 7 o'clock on NBC. It's like, come on, I'm from Indiana. My dad went to Indiana. My sister went to Indiana. I'm a huge Hoosiers basketball fan. I'm not watching that game.
Well, speaking of Indiana too, you talk about Notre Dame having that exclusive contract with NBC to broadcast home games. They only play 2 to 3 night games per year. Maybe I'm mistaken on that. It seems like they play about 2 to 3 per year. That's going to severely limit their ability to play on NBC in primetime at home.
Yeah. Well, the other thing is that the noon game for the Big Ten makes them seem like an amateur conference. Like when you have Michigan and Ohio State playing at noon, it just really does.
Well, hold on. Let me correct you on that though, because the Big Ten, the difference with the Big Ten and with the SEC is we enjoy going to football games in November. The Big Ten, it's a different. They used to not even do night games in November. It's so damn cold up there. Ohio State, Michigan has always been at noon. That's always been a thing. That's not a Fox thing.
Yes, amateur. It's an amateur conference playing that game at noon. Because you know what? The best game in the SEC,
bro.
The best game in the SEC used to be at 3:30, and you know what they realized? You put it at 7:30, 8 o'clock, and all of a sudden you dominate the ratings. And so the SEC used to have Jefferson Pilot, where it had its crappy games on at noon. Then you get the 3:30, which is a good game that CBS had, and then you play the rest of the conference games where everybody's interested between 7 and 8 o'clock at night. The Big Ten's going to do it in reverse. They're going to have their best game at noon because Fox is paying more for this, and so they're going to get to retain that game at noon. So you're going to get that. Then 3:30, you're going to get sort of like the second helping from the first game, and then by the time you get to the night, you really are going to be watching Indiana play Purdue. You really are going to watch Rutgers playing Maryland, and
a lot of USC and UCLA. I'm guessing.
Well, maybe, but not in. Again, who cares who's in Big Ten country? Like, you don't even get your own eyes watching UCLA and USC to that sort of stuff. So it's going to be fascinating to see what happens. I don't think the ratings are going to be there in a way that returns the investment. And, if you're the SEC, the thing you got to be a little bit concerned about is that if these entities decide that this amount of money isn't worth it, then what can you do in your renegotiation? Because this doesn't just require the game of the week draws big ratings. This requires that you got wall to wall people tuning in all day long. And, look, I just don't think that the Big Ten's gonna demand that for the lower end of the conference.
It's definitely a number to shoot for. I think we should have Dr. Evil negotiate the SEC's contract too. How much money do you want a year? $1 billion. That sounds crazy, but we've hit that mark. I'm not going to downplay what the Big Ten's doing here because I think it's a great layout. They're able to come up with that number because they're utilizing multiple networks. I think it's a good system what they're coming up with, and I think it's a sign of things to come with the SEC. Where right now we're kind of locked in with ESPN a little bit with the SEC. I think the way they're playing all these networks off each other to come up with a deal like this. Imagine if the Big Ten's going to do this, imagine what the SEC is going to do when they come up when they're clear of the next contract.
So mark my words, the SEC will have a game on Amazon in its next incarnation. Probably YouTube too, but some sort of streaming service will carry SEC games in the next contract. And this is going to be Bezos money. I mean, so it's not so that's who you're going to have bidding against you and bidding things up and that sort of stuff. Look, I think this is probably great for the SEC from the standpoint of a new number's been set. And we see this, right? That Tom Brady makes X dollars. And so Peyton Manning has to make more than him. And then Aaron Rodgers has to make more than him. And then Patrick Mahomes has to make more than him. And so, the fact that Mahomes signs later than Rodgers means Mahomes gets more money, right? But the next time Rodgers renegotiates, Rodgers is going to get more money. And that's sort of the key point is there's renegotiation in there. And ESPN is going to realize that the SEC, and probably has already realized, that the SEC has quite a bit of leverage. And so getting into good faith negotiations about how to prolong this relationship is probably in the best interests of ESPN. And so we'll see. I think, again, rising tide raises all boats. I think the SEC will be better off for the fact that the Big Ten's bringing in all this money. I'm just not sure that it's not going to change my watching habits. I mean, I'm definitely like, it's funny. I sound anti Big Ten, but it's just because they never win when they get into the playoff these days. Now it's either Clemson or an SEC team.
I'm not even going to try to sway you on your opinion of the Big Ten at this point. It's well established.
Yeah, well, they killed it in 2020 when they said, "Oh, we're just not going to play."
That's fair criticism until Kevin Warren, as long as he's in office there as commish, you can go after that. That's fair.
I mean, he only decided to play after Trump told him to. So,
was that what did it?
I don't know. There was that whole Clay Travis thing with Trump interviewing, and he was just like browbeating Warren. And, all of a sudden things flipped. I don't think it had anything to do with Trump. Now, Trump took credit for it, which was kind of amusing.
Well,
but
that's a different thing of whether or not it had anything to do with it. Those are two different things, man.
If nothing else, it was 2020. Nobody was working, and it was amusing. So,
Well, we got to the point where we brought up Trump, so probably time to call it a show, huh? We'll move on. We'll move on.
Well, those are the documents they raided in Mar-a-Lago, man. Was documents regarding
it was the Big Ten TV contract.
It was, what did he have on Kevin Warren? How did he get him to play through COVID? That was the documents.
We negotiated a beautiful, beautiful deal with NBC, CBS, and all. All right, let's call it. Next week, football season's here. Fired up. Everybody enjoy their last weekend without football. It's okay to enjoy a weekend without football when you know it's the next weekend away. So that's my justification for that.
This is the last weekend for the next 4 months to properly have a wedding. Yes. And then no weddings for the next 4 months. If one of your friends had a wedding, they're not really your friend. And, you definitely shouldn't be in a wedding party because they're going to cost you money and make you miss college football.
Shut it down. Shut it down.
This is why it's good that I'm old, though. None of my friends are getting married, so I don't have to worry about
it. All right. Another episode in the books here. We'll see y'all next week. Go Gators.
Go Gators.
Thank you for watching this episode of Stand Up and Holler. Be sure to subscribe to the Read and Reaction YouTube channel, join our Patreon community at Read and Reaction for bonus content each week, and check out our website at readandreaction.com. I'm Nick Knutson, joined by Will Miles, and as always, go Gators.